Hello and welcome to The Great Game, an Australian mega game podcast. I'm here with designer Chris Smellenhorst of Melbourne Megagames and also, of course, as always, my friend Pat. And we're here to talk about This City Sucks, a mega game of vampires, werewolves, street gangs, and urban planning. Chris, why don't you introduce yourself and just let us know how you got into this and how you kind of ended up designing this game.
Yeah, thanks, and it's nice to be here. I've been a listener of the pod for a little while, but it's nice to finally be on. I've been with Melbourne Megagames for quite a while. I guess I got into mega gaming quite early on in Victoria, in Melbourne, anyway. There used to be a group that ran down in Geelong called Pulp Mega Games. That myself, Tristan and Nelly, who you've had on not Nelly, but Tristan, you've had on the podcast before. We went down and played a few of those, mostly Watch the Skies. And then after they folded, we started running them up through our board games club at university. And kind of went from there. And university was a great place to start because it meant venue costs were nothing, which I'm sure as people who have run mega games, can be a big expense of running them. But I've more or less played or facilitated every game that Melbourne Mega Games has run since. So it's probably getting close to 6, 7, 8 games at this point. Yeah, and I guess I got to a point where I'd played enough of them, had my own thoughts, bugbears and things that I thought, I could probably improve on that or tweak that, that I decided that I'd try and my hand at it. And I guess This City Sucks is the result of that.
By the time you decided that you were going to design a game, had you crossed the line into majority being a facilitator of the games, or were you still doing a bit of playing?
I guess we're lucky that we tend to run each game twice, and so I would say usually for at least the first half of the games we ran as a non-for-profit, I guess I would play one, facilitate one in some order. I guess as the group has gotten bigger and bigger, and we've gotten more people interested in Melbourne, I've taken a back seat on facilitating if there are other people that are willing to jump in for the first time. But it's something I enjoy doing. I think there's a lot of facilitation that I enjoy being able to help players, get as much out of a game as possible. It's fun. That being said, I'm not from a role-playing background or anything. I've got very limited D&D or RPG experience. I definitely come from a board gamey side of it more than anything.
That's interesting. I'm surprised to hear. I think most of the people we chat to who are designing mega games are on the RPG side of things. So that's cool. So tell us about This City Sucks and what's the game about? What's the elevator pitch?
Yes, so This City Sucks, as you said, is a mega game of werewolves, vampires, street gangs, and urban planning. I guess Belmont Bay is the setting in the early 2000s on a nondescript West American coastline, where players, I guess, fight it out for supremacy of a small, slightly sleepy city. That comes in many forms. It can come in gang warfare on the streets by beating each other up in combat, or through domination of urban real estate, buying, selling, and building. So really, it mixes my personal loves and obsessions with urban planning and transit planning with vampires and werewolves in early 2000s schlock. So it was a better fit while designing it than I expected it to be. It's very humorous in a lot of ways with its bureaucracy, and that's where I tried to focus a lot of the attention.
Nice. It's funny to hear that, because I don't think in my head, planning and real estate and combining that with vampires, it's a perfect match. But I definitely understand sort of the territory changing and the gang warfare and stuff. Definitely fits well. I'm curious. So you said that those are sort of some of your interests. Where did the inspirations come from? Like, were there specific things, or was it more just you thinking about these things that you like and thinking, well, maybe that's a theme for a game?
Yeah, I guess had a few thoughts. I think, like everyone does to some extent, had a few thoughts on random notepad documents and books here and there. But I think the main thought that got me started on designing it was I thought the imagery of people who are dressed up to a mega game, which is also just one of my favorite components anyway. Seeing how people costume for a mega game, but having everyone like that sit down really seriously in an auction hall and bid with paddles was like the first visual that I wanted in my game. Because it was just really funny to me. And so I guess from there I kind of tried to build out an auction and real estate game that was somewhat fun and engaging with a main map. And then building from that, I guess I need a combat system or a way to aggressively take property from other players. And that's where I guess the gang warfare kind of fell into it, at which point in my guess, I guess, thinking about both A, combat systems, and B, kind of what schlocky and fun that players can engage with, came on vampires and werewolves, basically. There's specifically the combat system more or less takes off from the board game Fury of Dracula, if you've ever heard or played it. And so I guess having that there as a baseline for what vampire and human combat looks like, I guess we kind of expanded on that in lots of silly and stupid ways, as well as adjusting the systems to make it fit a mega game context.
It's very very true to a mega game that the vampires and all that crazy stuff came second. I like that. And that you just wanted an auction house, and you just wanted property dealing and all that kind of stuff. That makes a lot of sense. I can follow the logic. And was this the first game that you have designed properly?
Yeah, it is. I wouldn't say I've designed a game in this sense per se before. I have had a passing interest in game design, both in a video game sense and a board game sense, I guess, from being around them my whole life. But first actual project, I'd say.
Yeah. And how does that feel? Like, I feel like I can relate to that in not really. I think I got told off in a recent episode about saying I wasn't really a game designer because I don't feel like one, and I don't have anything in my background that connects to that as a proper noun, I suppose. How does that feel, having this first thing out and with your name on it, and having seen it go through testing, and now it's just a couple of weeks ago it was run sort of fully fledged? How does that feel? Do you feel like a game designer now?
No, I think I definitely sympathize or empathize with that thought. I think when we were doing our wrap up for the game, and Melbourne Megagames was like, and the game designer Chris Mellenhorst, it was a bit, you're right, it feels a bit wrong to say it, but at the end of the day, I guess you've gotten 50 people in a room to pay money to play your product. It does, I guess it definitely became more real, I guess, after we play tested it and started getting facilitators interested in running it. I think at that point, even though it's not necessarily game design, I think it definitely sank in, I guess, from that first time round when we started having facilitator training before our game. Here's a project that we're actually about to run, and I've got to teach people how to run a game that has for 2 years at this point been 90% in my head, but is now on a piece of paper. So yeah.
It gets real.
It's such an exciting moment, and I think it never fully feels real. But I think if you've made a game, you're a game designer. That's it. But
no, I agree. I think that you got to take it like that. Even if even if you don't feel like you fill the shoes necessarily, or are still comparing yourself to other games and designers.
So let's talk through like some of the details about what players are actually doing in this game. Just take us through like for a regular team, like what the core roles are and what they normally like focused on doing.
Yeah. So I designed the game, and it was something I wanted quite strongly from the start, for players to not be in roles that are closed off for the rest of the game. So if you're someone who's in the council, I didn't want you to only be a councillor necessarily. So I wrote in the rules for the roles to be kind of freeform. That being said, if you're a player, I guess you are going to typecast yourself, and you are going to focus on the rules for a certain section. So I understand that. But in a standard 4-player team, and there's a few teams that aren't set out like that, there's, I guess, the councillor or politic kind of agent that would attend a council. There's a kind of a real estate mogul is what I call them, which is someone who is, I guess, aware of the game state, the city map where all the property is represented, and someone who attends the auctions and ideally tries and buys and sells their way into strategic outcomes, I guess, for themselves. I wrote the chief goon is the head combat specialist, I guess you could call them. There's a few different combat systems in the game, and so I guess I wanted one person at least on the team to be completely on top of what the combat rules are, so that if you are getting attacked or wanting to attack another player, you at least have someone that can facilitate and run combat. Combat in this game is largely meant to be able to run without facilitators or control getting involved. So it was important that someone be on top of the rules enough, I guess, that they can help facilitate and run their own combat encounters. And then I guess we've got a faction head kind of role that just is the glue that kind of sticks everyone together. But ideally is wheeling and dealing on the side, maybe setting up their own small micro councils if they need to have private team discussions, which happened in both games. Yeah. So, but like I said, ideally it was a bit freeform, and I designed the council in ways that meant that was possible. Combat can be done by anyone, and everyone in the game carries combat cards on them and is allocated them as part of their kind of income step of each turn. And anyone can go to the auction house. If you attend the auction house with your whole team, maybe you can bid against each other and win private property. There's a lot of framework of rules with some space there for obviously facilitators to help expand and encourage player plots.
I really like how open-ended it seems like it is. And I see in the rules you say, you can decide to elect your whole team to the city council, for example. And so how did you see any teams do that? Would that mean that your whole team is like going to the council most turns?
So there was definitely a couple teams that... So, sorry, let me step back a second. The elections are held after turn 2, or they were in our games anyway. And everyone has to submit physical paper ballots with a preferential vote on them, and then a popular vote for the mayor in the game. And so we quickly do a quick count on our lunch break of all the paper ballots. But there was no rule set to say that after that election, everyone starts with one councillor per faction. But after that election, there is just whoever's elected is on council at that point. So they're definitely in the first game, and in the second game, I think, some factions elected more than one person. But it was interesting seeing some light bulbs go off in players. The police teams, of which there are three-person teams, they all worked out that if all of them vote for the same people, there was almost a guarantee that they would be elected on council. And they were right, drawing 9 ballots out of a pool of 50 that all have the same organized voting method, I guess, does guarantee your votes. And council is pretty powerful in this game in their ability to control various aspects of the game. They have a lot of levers to pull, and a lot of mechanical levers at that, to control the map and funding of other areas. So it is a pretty powerful sphere to get onto, which I guess kind of ideally highlighted to players why the election was important and something they should care about.
Awesome. We have just had a perhaps controversial episode on debating councils and things that can go wrong with them.
I listened. It was a good episode.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I think we came out a bit too negative, perhaps, on councils, because I do love councils. But I'm glad to hear that it's a very powerful council game. Do you want to talk about how it works and what makes it so enticing to people to want to be on and want to get elected into it?
Yeah, I personally, in my mega game playing, have, I think, been the councillor or the council player more often than in the other role. And I guess there's part of me that I like being that kind of person. But I have found a lot of your criticisms that you brought up completely relevant, and I was agreeing more or less the whole time. Given as someone who's facilitated those roles in games, I sit there feeling powerless as a facilitator a lot, trying to get players to engage with the game outside of council. So it was pretty core to me in my building of it as a system that the game itself runs on a rule set that I've called the bylaws, that are up on the wall, but those bylaws are mutable. Basically, councillors can a petition to change the wording, and that includes the format of council, how many councillors there are, what does council do. So there's a lot of potential space there. I also then kind of, because obviously there's a lot to work with and that can overwhelm players, tried to direct players into a certain set of policy cards, I guess, that they could use as kind of pro forma motions that they could take to council. So for example, not that we've talked about the city map yet, but the map itself is broken into city blocks, and those blocks are then grouped into districts. There's a policy that you could put on that district that says no vampires are allowed to buy property in this district, or this district is having a street festival, so its well-being goes up 3 points, something like that. Councillors could use those in their writing of motions to make their motions easier to pass. So it wasn't a flat-out councillors can't just make up whatever they want, because we want to encourage that. But you needed councillor signatures in order to pass motions. So or to table the motions, I should say. So each motion needed 2 signatures and a policy card, or if you weren't using a policy card, 4 signatures. And that was a change that we made from game 1 to game 2. But it did mean that we saw really interesting things in game 2, where there were people who were just using the policy cards, which was good because it kind of drove play in a way we wanted. But there were councillors that did just get the 4 signatures from other councillors to make massive omnibus motions where like they were changing 5 or 6 different stats or funding tracks. and we were really happy to see that, because that was obviously the fruit of a lot of negotiation behind the scenes.
That's awesome. And why was it that you made that change from 2 to 4 signatures? Was it just too easy to get crazy motions through in game 1? Was it
no, I wouldn't say it was too easy, and there are mechanics as well that punish the council for not passing all tabled motions. So in that 20-minute action, that basically it's the duty of the chair to blitz through all the motions and put them up to vote to kind of prevent filibustering on motions. But ultimately we saw a lot of people kind of custom writing motions, which again was great, but they weren't then necessarily looking to interact with the game systems that were next to them as well. And so giving them the kind of, it's easier to write this motion if you engage with some systems versus you need 4 out of 10 of you to agree on this motion, kind of meant that if they were doing that, there had to be a really good reason for them to do that. Otherwise, engage with these systems in one of these 40 cards that we have laid out for you. And some of those, for example, those systems that we want players to engage with is property is meant to be a bit of a scarce resource in the game, but you can upzone or downzone districts. So in part of introducing kind of property into the game's economy that players can buy and sell, we kind of want players to upzone districts, but that's the thing a council does. And so by giving them those cards to say, hey, this is something you can do and should do, or at least have a view on whether you should do it or not, was something that was important to us. And so creating that change between games helped us kind of direct players.
You talked a fair bit there. Like, it sounds like the council... No, sorry. It sounds like the council had quite a bit of control over sort of laying out the strategy, I guess, or maybe the interactions that players would have with each other in other parts of the game, particularly the map you touched on a bit. Did you want to run us through how the map worked and how the real estate side of things functioned? Yeah.
So the map itself, I guess, unlike other mega games, doesn't exist as a space where players move units on a map. That there's no kind of active armies, or at least, they're not by default. If someone wants to build a tank, I guess we can facilitate that. But the map is more a reflection of game state than anything. And so, although council kind of influences what that looks like, I guess so do other areas of the game. The map itself is players buy SimCity style, I guess, zoned properties. So there's residential, commercial, industrial, or amenity. And once they own one of those properties, each property fits onto a kind of circular block of which it has a certain density. So one area of the game, I don't know, I think Wraithport Landing, for example, had a density of 3. So only 3 properties could exist on it. because you could only buy properties or attack properties in blocks you were in or adjacent to, I guess there was a bit of an area control mechanic going on where players need to spread their kind of tendrils of control across the city, but they're unable to do that if they can't, trade property with other people or buy new property. And so there's incentive there, I guess, to explore how do we create more property or how do I steal it from other players in order to get to certain parts of the city. The zoning, though, of the property itself affects abilities that you have on zone cards at your own tableau on each faction table. So players would sort their title deeds, which are like, Monopoly-style property cards, on their tableau. But if I have 3 residential properties and my residential zoning policy says for each residential property, I get +3 money every round or some other effect, there's quite a lot of them, that would all factor into a faction's income. And so there was a lot of shop front action, I guess, as well, where players would have to buy and sell and trade zoning cards from each other to upgrade their tableaus, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, nice. It sounds like quite a tight little game compared to some of the openness of the council.
It is
mechanically.
It was definitely a strange impulse for me over the design process of this game. I definitely went into it wanting it to be a lower crunch, higher RP kind of game. But as design went on and as playtests happen, I found myself having to kind of codify systems and kind of provide more certainty, I guess, for facilitators, but also for players, and ended up with, I don't want to say a crunchier system necessarily than I wanted, but it certainly ended up slightly more mechanical than I expected from the outset, I would say.
Yeah. Did you have any motivation to pursue some of that mechanical crunch because of like audience interest, I suppose? Like one thing that I've encountered in the past is trying to get the balance of kind of, you can't please everyone, but providing variety so that different types of players are going to enjoy different parts of the game. Did you kind of go in expecting certain types of players to go to certain parts of the game?
To some extent, yes. I mean, like I said, having that council background, I feel like I know what kind of person wants to go to council. And so other than formalizing some processes and providing levers, I was kind of happy with that sphere running the way I expected it to, basically.
Right.
However, when it got to things like the construction game, no, I would find it very difficult to explain necessarily on the podcast how crunchy it ended up being. But that being said, there was definitely some people on the day who went, in their minds, I want to play a crunchy board game and be better at it than other people, and spent the whole day in that sphere. And I don't blame them, because I guess the rules as written do expect a lot from players in that particular sphere. And so I guess if you've dedicated time to it and you see it as your avenue to getting a lot of money from the game, more power to you. But it definitely, I think, ended up in the spot where it provides a few different softer and harder mechanical avenues for players. But I would say, other than trying to provide that looser RP element, which I think I got, but maybe not quite to the quantity I wanted initially, I guess it wasn't my primary design intent.
Yeah, okay. Makes sense. I was really keen to push us on to combat, because I was talking to Jack about this before the podcast, and I was really interested in the combat mechanics and the raids in the game. Did you want to walk us through that and the inspirations for those mechanics and how they worked?
Yeah. So I'll start with the combat. So the game differentiates, as you kind of point out there, between player-on-player combat, which can be facilitated up to a 3v3 level, versus what a raid is. And I'm using quotes with my fingers, not that you can see that. And a raid existed in a few different iterations through the design lens. The player combat has been in its form pretty much from dot. The raiding went through lots of different iterations. I wanted in the game there to be, if you're getting attacked by people, presumably because they want to steal your property or money or something, that they have to go through some defenses before they hit you as a player. Basically, you're locked in a house and they need to break in first. So the rating was a fine line to balance, and I don't think I quite got it, to be honest, but was meant to provide defenders some kind of bonus to weaken the attackers, but also provide the defenders with information before they got to the player combat stage. The rating itself is a disc flicking minigame, which is something I quite enjoyed putting together, where you have to hit numbered tiles on a grid in the order 1, 2, 3, and then hit your way to the defender's goal. There are obstacles in the way that, are more or less like glued down poker chips that act as kind of almost pinball bouncers. And the defending player also has a disc and is trying to obstruct your flicking to hit the switches. All during that process, you're taking damage and revealing cards. And so it has the potential to be quite a quick game. I think in practice, players end up taking longer with it than I expected. And so I think definitely, not that people listening to this pod necessarily have played the game. A change I want to make is bringing that raiding mechanic out of standard combat. So not just regular, I'm coming to attack you, and making it special for certain buildings in the game. So, for example, if you're raiding Town Hall, which is a building owned by someone, or a police station, or trying to steal the hospital from another player, something that kind of adds stakes, I guess, to a raid situation, as opposed to something that delays what players actually wanted on the day, which is player-to-player combat, which is something that came out of playing the game twice and trying to simplify the raid rules, but then just saying, no, actually what players want is the combat because it's fun and enjoyable. So let's actually just give them what they want in that sense.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Yeah, but the combat itself is, like I said, if you've played Fear of Dracula, fairly similar. It does, however, expand on that system by adding more suits to the game. So it is, in its essence, a bit of a paper, scissors, rock with like 5 or 6 different symbols. But if you aren't blocked by the other card using, a paper to block a rock, for example, the text effect goes through. And you keep playing rounds, but every round you play, you leave some cards on the table, deal some damage, learn more about your opponent's hand of cards. And yeah, it works pretty surprisingly well in practice, I would say. And I think players, although it takes a bit of a learning curve, after one encounter, got it fairly quickly. I also think that, and not to jump topics, if you want to stay on combat, that's fine. I think that I made fairly clear in the rules and in the game as well that I wanted player death to be a fairly minor experience, if at all. And I wanted the consequences of being defeated to be rewarding to players, because that's something I've struggled with a lot in mega games personally. And so I think I hit that as a mechanical note in a way that players were happy to engage in combat, because the consequences of a bad combat outcome may be bad for your faction, but on a player level aren't too deteriorating or damaging.
Yeah, well,
That's good to hear.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about quite a bit in the past, the death stuff and how that can impact someone's experience. How did you tackle it?
Yeah, so for people that have played Pandemic Legacy, there's a system in that game, or people that haven't, I guess, there's a system in that game called Scars, where it's basically you as a player take little stickers and add them to yourself, but they have an ongoing text effect. In the game, you get them for a bunch of different reasons. But in this game, I wanted players who died or reached 0 health, I think I say fainting or knocked out in the rules, to basically develop as a character, but not necessarily lose terribly much. So they get scars, which they draw out of a bag randomly that is a sticker they just attach to their player ID. But it can range from really stupid minor stuff to mechanical impact. And I let players draw 3 and choose 1, so there's a bit of self-direction and choice in how they actually approach their growth as a character. So, for example, it can range from anything to, I think there was some scars that said, you are now a passionate advocate of lane widening road projects, to ones that full on just say, like, every third combat round you have to choose a random card because of, you cross-eyed or something. There's text effects that basically gave some flavor to it. But I think in doing that, you give players some agency over their death, whilst also giving them something fun to self-select into, which I think helps. There's also a system in the game called Resolve, which is you basically get a token if you die that says next time you go to take lethal damage, you can negate that damage, so that players aren't beat up ongoing over and over again if they're a little weaker at combat, or whatever other reason they might be losing combat. That being said, the change I made from game 1 to game 2 was also expanding that to be closer to a D&D style inspiration, where players could be awarded resolve for different reasons and in different game spheres other than combat, and spend them for discounts or trying to amp up their plots with facilitators. So between getting scars in different areas of the game, so like at Council, you got a scar if you failed a motion, or in the construction game, if you didn't meet your quotas, you got a scar, or if you retired as chairperson, you got a scar. Also in combat, getting those resources to really encourage players to, I guess, collect these things to grow as characters, but also to use as resources across the game, but not in an economy-based way, more as a we're not necessarily rewarding you for dying or losing, but we want to let you come back from that in some way.
That's cool. I also saw in the rulebook that you also have kind of these two separate zones, jail and hospital, where you might go when you faint or when you are defeated in combat. And you can either, once you're in hospital or jail, you can either wait out your sentence, or you can try to break out by doing a maze, or you can bribe your jailer. How did that work in practice?
In practice, I think now, and you're right to say jail and hospital, because mechanically they act as very similar spaces. Players only went to the jail if there was a police member, which is one of the factions, in their combat, so they were kind of taken to jail. Everyone else had to go to hospital, which was owned by a faction. The idea, I guess, was to, again, give players, a few minutes after combat death to just kind of, reflect a little without necessarily taking them out forever. I would say in practice, the hospital didn't quite work because asking a player team to basically babysit dead players, although in my mind gives them an opportunity to kind of, collect bribes and do things, does require a player to sit there ongoing or be cognizant of when players are sent there. That being said, the police side of it made a lot more sense in gameplay because they had to be present in combat. They saw when people, got knocked out and had to escort them to jail, at which point they also were encouraged to engage with a different system in the game, which is the police are solving a murder mystery. And every player in the game has a prepared witness statement. And so there was a bit of a bargaining there that could happen with inmates where they would almost always go, hey, will you let me out early if I give you my witness statement, or if I give you some money, to which the answer is usually yes.
I was really interested to see that on your ID card, the front says your name and your character name and your pronouns, and has some slots for scars. And then the back has these 3 statements about the night of April 13th, where the mayor died, where
tragic day.
Tragic day. But I think I saw somebody holding a knife or things like that. How did that? So everyone had a bunch of these statements which you needed to put together.
Yeah, so everyone in the game had, like you said, a small A5 card with 3 statements on it. In the game, the police are tasked, but also the media team are tasked with solving this murder. And the police game is actually modified with an ongoing negative modifier for not having solved the game. But I guess in a team of 3, the police are kind of self-allocate, or it seemed that way anyway in both games, where one person put themselves in charge of solving the mystery and the other 2 did quote unquote standard police work. So the player cards themselves, in the rules it says to players that all of your statements are either all true or all false, basically. There's also rubbish answers thrown in there that mean nothing, right? Like, oh, I ate dumplings on that night. Yum, yum, they were tasty. Which obviously mean nothing to the police. But players would then give that information to the police, the idea being that if the police collected enough of them, they could see that there are more of these true statements about this specific fact than there are this lie about it. We're going to guess that that's the truth. And the police facilitator is empowered to collect basically Cluedo-style guesses to say, oh, the mayor died on the steps with this weapon by this person. And there are 10 correct, or 10, I guess, questions you have to answer about the night of the mayor's death. But we let police say, submit a question card with 5 answers, and if you had at least 3 of them right, you would be told those answers, which actually came to me from the great video game Return of the Obra Dinn. I don't know if either of you have played it, but when you guess enough correct answers, it tells you if you're correct or not. And so you can do a bit of deduction work by submitting a guess every round and seeing if you're getting the right answers or not. So there's meant to be a bit of play there, but also a bit of if you're actually collecting enough answers from people and collaboratively working with other police stations, you can actually get all the information you need.
That's super fun. I love that. I love this kind of mystery solving element. My question though is, if you replayed the game, would you potentially already know the answer to the mystery?
You would. And I guess, that's one, I guess, flaw with that system. That being said, we did have players that returned for the second game. I would say that for players in non-police teams, it really exists as a reason to give you interaction with the police that's positive and not, adversarial. And for the media team and police teams who are solving it, we did get someone come in for the second game who had already seen the mystery, and they just self-selected out of it, which worked well because realistically, not every player needs to be solving this mystery. And we can, of course, as facilitators, spice it up here and there if we need to. But you're right. It does kind of give the game a one-time feel to it if you're in that space. There are a couple mechanics like that for other factions as well. Each faction in the game is given a unique bonus or kind of mechanic on their tableau, which is something I did because I'm a massive fan of the game Root, where every faction is kind of asymmetrical. The game was meant to be more asymmetrical in its initial stages, but then, of course, me sitting there designing 10 factions went, wow, this is really hard. Wow, it's great to have the idea that you have 10 asymmetrical factions, but as soon as you actually go to build it, you're like, geez, there's a reason balancing things is hard. So they ended up being kind of buffs to certain areas of the games that each faction got. But there are a couple factions that have secrets that are revealed over the course of a game. And so there's definitely a couple factions you couldn't play twice in a row, for example, because you get a reward for doing something. But I think there's enough variety in the game that if you played a player faction one game and then a police faction the next game, or the auction house the next, there's definitely enough variety there.
Yeah, makes sense. Nice. And speaking of that auction house, I think that's the only part of the game we haven't really delved into. And that was the thing that first inspired you to make this game. So how does it work?
Yeah, I guess I had, obviously there's a kind of a long history in a lot of mega games of devolving the media component of a game away from facilitators and down to players. And so I guess it was an attempt to try and do that in a different space, because I thought releasing kind of property into the game's ecosystem could be something that we do quite easily as Control every round, just revealing new properties and then putting them up on a board for players to buy. I really wanted the opportunity to see if we gave players control of that space and a bit of the kind of shop front element of a game as well, how that would interface with players and their desire to just acquire stuff. So every round, the 2 auctioneers have to do a few things, basically. There's an amount of private property that gets released onto the market if the game opens a new area for development or upzones a previous district so that there's more property available. When that happens, they get to select a few of those. They mark down the reserve price for each of those, which is based on the wealth value of the district. And then they take those and anything else that players want them to sell to the auction house, at which point they basically host an auction, at a podium, asking for player bids. They all sit there with paddles and bid. and basically they take a cut of whatever they earned. In both games, it actually was worse in game one. They made so much money because players were kind of recklessly bidding against each other, which, you know, in a game with some money issues at the start in terms of how liquid people are, is shocking to me. But definitely as the game progressed and people were just outbidding each other with silly money, they were kind of sitting there rubbing their hands together, you know, and then sitting there with piles of money. In the first game, the auction team had so much money that we had to kind of, as facilitators, try and help them with ideas of what they could do with all the money. It ended up being buying out one of the police stations from the city and having their own private militia. But in the second game, we introduced some new things here and there to be basically money sinks in the game for players. But we also retooled some of the finances for the auction house so they didn't get quite as stupidly rich. They also have a loose quest line where their founder and patron of the auction house, Mr. Coffinsley, has demands every round that they have to try and meet. Otherwise, they see some kind of consequences or boons, depending on if they make or fail those tasks. But yeah, it is interesting as a pseudo player, kind of pseudo facilitator role. I think it does expect players to be quite, you know, gregarious and outward going, but I think if you cast for that, it's usually not an issue. In a similar way that media is often, I think, very defined by the people who are in it.
Yeah. It sounds like an incredibly fun role. It sounds like the kind of thing I would love to do. It reminds me a bit of the Dune board game. I think has a similar mechanic where one person is, you know, runs the
the Spacing Guild
options. Yeah, where, you know, whenever you want to actually do stuff in the game, you have to pay the Spacing Guild, and they can get incredibly rich.
No, and look, and they also help us in a way facilitate a lot of the information flow in the game. A lot of the buying and selling kind of, because I said at the start, the city map is a reflection of game state, and so a lot of information happens in the game, and it's probably one of the bigger issues with it as a game is that information flow between spheres is really key. So there's a lot of paperwork in the game, which helps with the theme, frankly, of like every time you purchase a property or transact, you need to sign off on a title deed transfer form and have both parties sign it. And so there's a bit of indoctrination you have to do with the auction team to say, okay, you must get people to sign this paperwork because otherwise the map will go out of date. Similar to council, though, they're all signing motions and ideally players are all signing deed transactions, but you really do need all of that paperwork so that when the map facilitator gets it, they can update the properties properly and let people's incomes actually reflect what they should be earning.
I do love that. And I know there was, in the Discord, there was a line that one team had produced twice as much paperwork as the second highest team, which is...
No, it's definitely, I think, yeah, if you see the matrix behind the game and really kind of engage with some systems, you can do some stupid stuff. Like the deed transfer form gets you to select a box in it that says, was this a property auction, council motion, legal transfer, illicit transfer of wealth? You know, there's a whole bunch of random bureaucratic tick boxing that you have to do. In the second game, it was great because our facilitators also brought stamps to dramatically stamp paperwork, which, you know, made it even better.
You mentioned there was some amount of freeform element where you could auction off. Did players have some ability to auction things that weren't planned, that were a bit, you know, their own weird ideas? Yeah,
so, I mean, frankly, it was completely up to the auction house facilitators to accept lots from players and put and they're given carte blanche, you know, authority to dictate with those players what their terms are or fees are, basically. Yeah, so players could really auction anything they wanted. I was kind of surprised we didn't get like a player auction themselves off to another team. No, and we definitely got a lot of other than property, like combat cards and like relic cards and stuff, and other mechanical components make their way through the game as well through there, which was good to see. So players do engage with it. I think the one weakness of it as a sphere, if there was one currently, is that as the game gets to its kind of last turn madness, players kind of decide that their board or map positioning doesn't necessarily matter so much as their crazy schemes and combat with other players. And so there definitely was a bit of a slowdown in the last turn or two of people wanting to engage with it as a system. And so I think definitely the next run of the game is definitely going to see us tweak at least what their quest line is to kind of account for that in some respect.
It's interesting that you mentioned Last Turn Madness, because that is we literally just recorded a podcast on that one. Did you find lots of any particular crazy schemes that stuck out that were going off last turn or ridiculous things that exploded?
Absolutely. I think given it's a bit of a rule in the game that players can't really die permanently, there was not so much assassinations and nukes like there are in other games, but we definitely had some weird stuff. There's relics that players find throughout the city. It's the lore of the game that vampires and werewolves have recently misplaced / lost the relics required to create new vampires and werewolves. So towards the end of the game, as they may or may not find those relics, you definitely see some people starting to transform and potentially join forces with other teams, which is fun. I think what was really fun in game one that I enjoyed is there's a human faction called Concerned Citizens Against the Occult, and they play a bit of a Karen faction where their job is to make people, low density and high property value, negative Nancy's. They decided that they really wanted to get into yachts and boats and to basically leave the city, but in like an exclusive way. And so we actually created a new district for them. They orchestrated all this off the map on basically part of the ocean, and all the districts on the map are bounded in twine on push pins, where they had their own property that was a yacht. And then they paid the police to come out and police that district as well, because other players were trying to join them in their exclusive district yacht fiasco. And so that was great to see, because I guess they rightly saw the progression of the game is people want to acquire property. They upzone everything so that there's more property, which is kind of against their quest backing, I guess, their goals. And so they went, if we just create a new district out in the ocean and fund it ourselves, we can live here by ourselves. And they're right. They did. Yeah. Having the police elect themselves under council was fun as well. There was some shenanigans there. Lots of random crazy stuff going on. But no nukes.
Well, that's good.
We had a district raise into the sky, Bioshock style, with balloons. I only heard that like 2 days ago, but
I love that. I love when the person sort of the core brain behind the game doesn't know these things.
You miss stuff. It actually, I think it was interesting to me game controlling the amount of the game you tend to spend problem solving and bug fixing for other facilitators. You do really have to kind of actually make an effort to get in there and hear what players are doing in a way that I didn't quite expect you to. It's because I've not game controlled before. It actually, players don't tend to come and ask you necessarily about the details of their insane plots, but your facilitators come up to you and ask you a mechanical question that's clearly related, and you have to dig a bit to get the actual information. Well, hang on, why are you asking me this question? Why are you asking me how much money people have to spend on balloons?
Yeah. It's definitely the most sort of disconnected role in the game, which is ironic for what it's meant to be doing.
Yes,
I do like that. I think that's the first mention I've ever encountered of a Karen role in a mega game.
the whole team all name themselves Karen, but with a different spelling.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah. It was also a visual in one of our aristocratic vampire factions. They all came with like champagne flutes with like cranberry juice and just sipped on it the whole time. It's just excellent.
Nice.
Very nice. Very nice.
I love that.
Now that you've kind of run through all of the different moving parts, it's a very diverse game mechanically. I'm curious how, because we talked a little bit earlier before we started recording about how you did do a sort of full playtest. Was it late last year?
Yeah, so would have been kind of mid last year and then probably beginning of last year would have been the kind of two we ran.
Okay, and so I'm curious how those went when you the very first encounter of putting all this into a physical space, and what had to change after you started testing things out, because there's a lot of moving parts happening here.
Yeah, and I guess I mean, obviously, Melbourne Mega Games did help facilitate them as sessions, but ultimately, how the sessions ran was largely up to me at that point. Um, I would say probably I didn't personally organize and run them in the best way in hindsight to get the actual information I probably wanted to out of players. I kind of, because the rule set was still a Google Doc that was kind of, 60% written, I kind of walked players through, and we had about 10 of them each session, walked them through each sphere and kind of got them to mechanically just try it out for 10 minutes each. To kind of let me know, A, does this feel fun? Do you think there's complexity here that would last a day? Do you have any thoughts or ideas? Really, it was quite interesting, game one, what spheres seemed to work with people and what didn't. Obviously, again, haven't designed a game before, but the combat, apart from being wildly unbalanced, players enjoyed both playtests straight up. So it was other than the content design of that, which I had great help from a few of my friends who play Magic the Gathering. They were straight on the committee of, hey, I need to design like 200 cards, please help me. But yeah, Auction House was something that was very much like, and Council as well for that matter. Here's how I want them to run a session. Do you think there'll be any problems or any issues? And largely the answer was no. The rating and building of property in the map format went through several iterations. It was really a design process. The rating wasn't always a flick game. The flick game came quite late in the process. It was more like players with a tile-based kind of flipping game. They had to like progress through a maze before they hit players, but like you would reveal a tile and it would say take damage or, reveal a card. And it was frankly, it was boring. and I tried a couple different times to spice that idea up, but didn't quite get there. But I did want that idea somehow, or at least the idea of there being a step before player combat. There was also issues I had with what is now the construction game, which again came quite late in the piece. Initially, there was a big system in the game, and you can still see it on the map because I left the checkboxes in. But every block was meant to have ruins kind of seeded in them. And so if you did construction, i.e. building or demolishing your properties to change what they were, you had to go to a little mini game and do a bit of like a cave exploration, which was initially based on a game called Diamond, I think, where you kind of have to flip cards and see hazards. Again, it was a bit hard to run, like notionally, and the information flow wasn't quite there. And so, and also, I think the biggest issue, more than anything for that, was that it didn't facilitate a game for enough players. I still had in my mind that this was going to be a game of 40 to 50 players at the time, and it didn't hold the interest of enough people. And I was deathly afraid the whole design process that there wouldn't be enough to do and people would be bored. I think that was my number one fear throughout the design. And so that game went through several revisions until it eventually became a whole copy of the game mat where players are moving little trucks around with resources to order slots, and players have to submit order forms to, build their properties. There's still issues with that game and its complexity because, if anything, I think I overcorrected and put in a very complicated share purchasing mechanic and like mini elections in the companies to hire drivers. I had an absolute beauty of a facilitator for both games who really understood and got into it and rolled with the punches. But it does need to be stripped down a bit. It is a bit crazy. But yes, so to answer your question, yeah, it was really interesting which spheres basically didn't change at all, and the couple that went through, frankly, 2 or 3 completely different games at the time, until I eventually settled on the disc game, because I personally think, a dexterity game is a bit of fun. And, obviously there was a lot of discussion as well about the accessibility of dexterity games as well. Yeah. And I think we ultimately settled on, well, if people need us to make accommodations or need to avoid it, we can work that out. Whether that's, self-selecting out of those roles or making accommodations. Ultimately, we were pretty happy to roll with it. And it seemed like we didn't face any of those issues on either session. So I think, other than changing the scope of it, maybe, I think it's probably going to stay in there.
Yeah, nice. It's a
makes
very
sense.
unique mechanic, and I feel like we've had conversations in the past about dexterity games and accessibility and that kind of thing. It feels like it's a small enough part of the game that you don't really need to codify a alternative. It can be kind of rolled with on the fly. So I'm glad that went well in practice.
Yeah, no, and it was an interesting one to design, because I remember kind of thinking about a flicking game, and obviously I went to Board Game Geek, looked at all the games with the flicking tag, and I was like, oh, how could this possibly function? And I went through a few iterations, but ultimately it works out pretty well. And we ended up just 3D printing a lot of the discs and components as well, and that was pretty seamless. So yeah,
Nice. I see the handbook. I think version 5 is the one you sent through to us, and it says 1.4. So it's obviously gone through quite a lot of revisions.
I'll flag that my version naming conventions are completely whack, but yes.
Oh, fair enough. But you mentioned that you are, planning to run it again in the future. How you've already talked a bit about it, but how did it go on your latest run through, and what are the big things you would plan to change?
Yeah, so I did include a change log in the rules, which I don't know if it's a done thing or not, but I think I also didn't provide an additional facilitator rule set, which is probably on the list of things to do, frankly. But it did mean that the people who ran it in Game 1 and Game 2 could get a quick idea of what actually changed, because I did make a lot of weird small changes. A lot of it was changing kind of incentive structures and balance tweaks. We did, though, I think, like I've alluded to before, change the way players interact with the SCAR system and Resolve to kind of expand that into other areas of the game. Added a couple money sinks in, and there was a system in Game 1 that, if I take a step back, when players are getting raided by other players, they can choose to take money, property, or a bunch of other things. In the initial game, when you were being raided, you basically had to close your vault, which has all of your faction container stuff, and you weren't allowed to touch it until the raid was over. And so players weren't allowed to carry money on them either. And so there was a whole system in the game called checks, where basically every player had to write out an IOU, and you then had to go to that player's table and try and cash it in at some point, at which, of course, doesn't mean they necessarily had the money to pay you, which was an interesting system. I think it was designed to cause shenanigans and to facilitate the raiding as well. I think we got 2 or 3 turns into the game on its first run through and went, this is too hard. There are players that are, not filibustering on raids, but taking so long that players couldn't get money out to do transactions. There were players just not understanding or dealing with it, so walking around with money. And so it got to turn 2, and we just said on the speaker, all right, no more checks. We're not doing checks anymore. You can just take money around. This is how it's going to work. And so that kind of carried through. But yeah, it was quite a big componentry change, but ended up working. I guess the other thing was the signatories on the motions changing, like I talked about before in the council section. I also codified dueling between players. I think having the combat rules be kind of so specific and kind of contextualize in a raiding section meant that players weren't really comfortable, might be putting it too strongly, but ready to just walk up to people and challenge them to combat. And so giving that a bit of narrative flair to say, oh, here's the rule set, here's, almost Hamilton style, right? Like, you need to get a second, and you need to sign a contract first, and you need to say what the terms are. It meant that in the second game, at the very least, we got some good moments with players, dueling each other to steal things from each other and, reclaim honor, all the stuff you expect. But no, it's definitely something that I walked away from Game 1 with my own thoughts. I then spent time interviewing each one of my facilitators, basically, and had anywhere from a 15-minute chat to an hour and a half chat with some of them about how their areas ran, and basically wrote out a whole bunch of changes
Yeah.
that I hope weren't me overcorrecting, but I do feel that in game 2, 95% of the changes I made were positive and well taken. So I can only hope that, after this game, I've seen a few more things that I want to change. We'll keep refining till we get to that point where, it runs smooth as butter.
Yeah.
That's fantastic to hear.
It's a challenging thing for maker games that we've talked about as well. Again, we've talked about before. How you can overcorrect forever, kind of. You can just tweak. There's so many things that you can tweak that it's hard to know when you're finished. But it sounds like this has already gone through quite a comprehensive evolution, which is pretty cool and kind of unique as well, because I feel like a lot of games are out the door. Maybe they get one test in, then they go to play, and then they're shelved. So this sounds like quite a passion project. Do you have plans to run it again already? Do you have a time frame that you expect to run it again and want to make some tweaks to it in the meantime?
Yeah. So not to pre-announce anything because I've had nothing confirmed with me directly. We did have some people from Adelaide come and play it, from Adelaide Megagames, and they seemed quite keen on considering it to run somewhat soon. So fingers crossed that does happen. Because I'd like to. I haven't been to Adelaide personally, so if I could drive a bunch of crap to Adelaide, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying you don't necessarily want to overcorrect based on feedback. There are definitely things that I think are obvious and from feedback that you can change, but I think at some point you've got to go, am I making these corrections because it's someone else's thoughts and I'm making it their game and what they want to see versus I guess what my vision for it was and is as a project.
Yeah.
In terms of Melbourne Megagames running it again, I can't imagine we'll run it again for like another 5 years or so. It tends to be no, and that's not to say that it didn't run well, but I think there are enough people that I'm aware of in my brain in the Melbourne Megagames community designing their own games, that they've gone through some playtests, some are still not there yet. Between that and wanting to run games that we've run previously, I think It Belongs in a Museum is coming up on our schedule. Apologies if that wasn't formally announced. It wasn't my game anyway. So I think if we run it again, it won't be for a few years. But that being said, I know that Leon from Melbourne Megagames, his game, The Ark, ran a couple times and then has run in different settings, like up in Sydney. So there's opportunity there, I think, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
The rulebook is really beautiful, by the way. I love the graphic design and the styling and the general aesthetic of this blood red tinge paired with some old woodcut style artwork.
I had to make I had to make a specific black and white print edition for several of my control members because they were like, "It's lovely, but we need to read it."
Yeah.
Do you think there'll be any moment in the future where people might be able to access this game or run it themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm preempting a meeting that might happen on Monday about this exact topic. I would love for other people to be able to download and play it. I think at the very least, I want to create some better facilitated guidance because obviously a lot of it's in my head in terms of the actual running of it on a day. So aside from creating those documents, I think if people were interested, they could either go to Melbourne Megagames' website, and I think they have a bit of an expression of interest form on there. If not, there'll probably be a section at some point in the near future, fingers crossed, that lets people ask about it directly on the Melbourne Megagames site. But I would love to see other people run it and do their own spin on it. Although I've annoyingly designed the rule set in InDesign, it was a bit of a excuse for me to learn that as a tool because it's been on my radar and something I've wanted to fiddle with for a while. So it's not a Google Doc at the moment, but I could probably arrange it in such a way that other players or groups from other places could tweak it if they wanted to, because I think that would be interesting in and of itself. I think I come of the opinion to some extent that if I'm not there running it, I really don't mind what you change about it. I think we, at least at Melbourne Megagames, have been quite successful in the past when we've been allowed to do it. tweaking a rulebook to run both for our circumstances and in ways we think improve our ability to run the game. And I think seeing people do that and hearing their feedback about things they changed and thought about differently can only, help with its design, I think, in a lot of ways. And so that's something I'd be really interested to see people do. Frankly, I think it would be interesting to see how people engage with it.
And it comes back to that thing you were saying about how you can sort of tweak it forever, but eventually you need to ask the question about whether or not you're just changing it for the sake of satisfying someone else's vision for the game. So you might as well just put it out there and say, this is what I was happy with, go nuts. Yeah. And I think that's what the mega game world needs a lot more of. So I'm glad that you're looking at that. And it seems like a really sort of a new and unique addition to that library if you get it out there.
Yeah, no, and look, short of it being available at the cost of buying me a cup of coffee and maybe whatever Melbourne Megagames needs to keep running, I don't see it as a money-making venture because, as I'm sure you both are aware, the number of hours you spend on this thing over the course of 2 years is certainly an interesting experience. But no, I've come away from it having really enjoyed the process, and frankly, it's given me a lot of opportunity to work with tools and resources and people that I just wouldn't get to otherwise. So it's been really valuable in that sense as well.
Very cool.
Well, fantastic. I think that brings us to just about the end of our discussion. Chris, if people want to find out more or get in touch with you, where's the best step for them to go?
Yeah. So if you want to get in touch with, I guess, Melbourne Megagames, which although I'm not technically on the kind of admin group for, is probably the best way to reach me directly. That's melbournemegagames.com. There's likely some This City Sucks content on there that you can go and look at. If you want to get in touch with me directly, I guess I'm on Blue Sky probably now is the place to go. That's at Melonhead, spelled at MELENHEAD. But otherwise, keen to hear people, and it's great being part of, I guess, now the official design community of of Mega Games. I don't know how long it's going to take me to design another one if I do that.
Oh no, don't worry about that. No, you've earned your way in now. We'll send you the shirt, and you can just sit back and chill out,
sit on the throne forever.
Yeah.
No, thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for joining.